challenge, but hopefully we'll figure it all out in the next couple of minutes.
I've got it plugged in.
Next week was supposed to be Rob's sister speaking. Their mother was severely injured in Minnesota. Their father is in Wisconsin with a heart problem. So Rob is with his dad. His sister is with his mom. So Jackie is going to step in and tell us about her plans for retirement, which I think we're all very interested in. So she's just going to come in next week for that. Oh. Okay.
Even I couldn't.
How about right here? I've got the laptop up front. I mean, shouldn't I be able to just use it?
There you go. Just use your cursor.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. Appreciate your help. Thanks.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. So we are working out the last little technical details. We're good? Oh boy, we're good. I love that. Rob got a dedicated system for Forum donated to us, so we're really happy by his boss. Didn't cost the church a penny. And so whatever little budget we had for that, we get to save and put towards next year. But this was our first day to use it, so Rob got it all set up, and then, of course, his mother was in a tragic car accident against her as a pedestrian, and so she's in the hospital in Minnesota, and his sister, who's supposed to speak next week, is with their mother in Minnesota. His father has a heart condition. Rob is with his dad, who his mother was visiting in the hospital when she was hit, and he's in Wisconsin with his dad. So they're just pulled all over the place. Anyway, so this is our first day with the new system, and Rob isn't here. Can everybody else hear me? Okay. I'm not allowed to. So he's allowed to because we tested him this morning, but I don't have enough tests to test me every day. Okay, most can, but anyway, so this morning we have Rob, next week we have Jackie. Jackie's going to step in for Rob's sister. And so that's how it's going this spring. Jackie's going to talk about her retirement plans, which is going to be fun. So, Chuck Benson.
So can everyone hear me? Am I pretty good? Can you hear me if I come over here away from the mic? So? Okay. So I'm already 5 minutes behind. I'll try to pick it up. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the art and the imagination of the American West and the American Southwest. This is a series of paintings by a fellow I'm sure you're aware of, a guy named Thomas Moran. And this is in a place called Green River. And I just quickly want to remind us of a place called Rainbow Arch. And I'd like to start this really with, if I can work this business. Just bear with me, please. Frederick Remington. So Frederick Remington is just a really, really important artist of the American West and the American imagination. This is going to be an exercise in futility here. Okay, maybe I'll get it. Bear with me. He's very, very famous for a number of works that he did in the East Coast, but I want to focus on his art of of the sort of the Western imagination of cowboys and Indians, and some amazing works of Indians, and not just watercolors and oils, but some spectacular bronzes that he did. Some of you may be familiar with these. There's an incredible collection of these up in Wyoming, in Cody, at a museum up there, but his bronzes are really prized and incredibly desirable. This is one of my favorites, with 4 cowpunchers with their pistols drawn. One wonders what's going on to create all this drama. Some of the works that I really like by Frederick Remington are what are called his Nocturnal Works. So here we're looking at a painting of a group of Indians with a dwelling in the background and the glow of the fireplace. But the light, the primary light here is not the fireplace. The primary light here is the moon. And he painted a number of nocturnals, they're called, which are spectacular. This is one, I know we're a little washed out with the rose window in the back, but do we see the glow of the eyes of the wolf? Can you see that or not? You can't. Well, you just have to trust me. There's yellow-white of the stars, there's yellow-white of the wolf's eyes, and there's yellow-white of the reflection in the creek. Sorry about that. Again, very, very heroic in terms of the 19th century, of what's sort of going on with Frederick Remington. But a lot of his inspiration is also, here's the Scotch Greys, who were...
Just one other question, is there a way to expand the screen so it fills the whole screen?
It's up there already.
It's not as big as it could be. If not,
No, I think we're there. So these are the Scotch Greys in the lower left-hand part of this slide at the Battle of Waterloo. And of course, he's looking at people like Filippo, who were documenting and chronicling that battle, which was much, much earlier than in his life. He also, as probably you know, was hired by many, many newspapers to do regular illustrations. His counterpart, and somebody that maybe you're more familiar with, especially in this part of the country, is a fellow named Charlie Russell, or Charles Russell. Charles Russell was a tremendous artist in his own right, spent a lot of time in Montana, some time in Wyoming, and this is a painting on the part of Russell. If you kind of look at the fellow on horseback, he's pulling his jacket back, and he has a badge, and he has a shotgun aimed at these two guys that are just waking up. And it's sort of like, boys, I'm taking you in. This is another raucous scene on the part of Charlie Russell, and if we sort of look here, there's rifle blasts coming out of the Palace bar and hotel. One fellow's already down for the count right here, and other people are shooting back and forth, so he's sort of capturing a point in time. There's lots of poker chips in the dirt. There's bottles of liquor in the dirt. He's sort of capturing a point in time, and believe it or not, this isn't 1866, this is 1903, okay? So it's still the Wild West in 1903. It may be a little hard to see, but I just want to point out there's a body of a bighorn sheep right here. This fellow has shot it and he's gathering it, except there's a massive grizzly that has reared its ugly head right here and probably we don't know the outcome of all of this, but I suspect that the rifleman's going to let the grizzly have the bighorn sheep. I'm sort of thinking. We don't really know. He also did some wonderful, can you imagine having been on his mailing list, because he did a number of letters to people where he would illustrate them with watercolor and gouache. And these are all letters in the archives of Charlie Russell in that particular way. I really apologize for the fact that the light is really washing a lot of these images out. I really can't do anything about that. I'm sorry. He also did some wonderful bronzes that we see here. I love this one on the lower left with the fellow. He's trying to get onto the horse, and the horse isn't being very cooperative. And the one on the far right might be recognizable to all of us because it became minted by the U.S. Mint as an image. That particular warrior sort of bent over on his horse. If we kind of look over here across the creek, we'll see a group of wagons that are all circled or in an encirclement, in an encampment, and these are all scouts that are in a reconnaissance mode there. Here's another wonderful piece where the Braves are walking along in Big Sky country here with those sort of quintessential skies that we get not only here but in Wyoming, certainly in at least northern Arizona. It's that quintessential West. This is one of my very favorite paintings by him. It's of a herd of bison that have just navigated, and there's a huge part of this herd that's still navigating the river. But if we look here, there's actually sort of a lavender mist, which is the steam from the wet bodies of the bison. And at first you don't even see it, but trust me, there's two wolves right in the foreground here that are following the herd of bison, and then there's bison bones in the foreground. It's just a classically composed kind of work that is, I think, worthy of a European salon. And he was one of the guys, along with Remington, that was able and was respected enough to actually be shown in Europe. George O'Keeffe, most of us aren't used to a photograph of her when she's this young. She's very, very young in this particular photograph, and all of her life on Ghost Ranch, she painted this particular butte or small mesa that's called Pedranal, that's above that piece of property. She kept coming back to it again and again and again. There's a lovely shot of Pedranal. And if you visit Ghost Ranch, it's off to the almost due south, slightly west, but it's very, very dominant in that particular valley. The Badlands, she captured sort of the raw erosion, multicolored of the landscape. She was quite famous, for riding into Taos on a black Charger with not one but 2 6-guns on her belt, and a big black hat. This is a wonderful piece of this old, probably an old cedar, or maybe pinyon that's long dead, but all of a sudden sort of takes on this iconic spiritual nature on its own. And in terms of spirituality, some of you may know this particular painting of a cross by her, but she did a whole series of these. And this is one that I'm really fond of with the landscape, and you can just sort of see the sun setting right underneath the cross and the nails on the back of the cross in this particular work. And of course, she moves into this period of setting sort of iconic imagery, in this case, this beautiful, beautiful blossom against sort of the stark nature of the landscape, the sort of badlands, the erosion of the red and the beige landscape. And then, of course, at the very top of the painting, again, is Pedernal, that butte that was above Ghost Ranch. This is really one of the most emblematic of her pieces of this horns that are sort of curved to the skeleton, which seems to just sort of float in space above the landscape with these fabulous northern New Mexico clouds. Now, this is a photograph of a church just south of Taos. As you drop south of Taos, you drop down into a drainage right when you go past the Sagebrush Inn on the right. And on the left, you'd miss it if you're going at a pretty good clip, but there's a whole area that you can turn into, and there's a church there in a part of Taos that's called Anschutz de Taos. And she did an amazing painting of the back side, or the apsidial side of that church that faces to the west, which is kind of interesting because most Christian churches' apses face to the east because that's where the sun comes up. We're 90 degrees off here. Sorry to burst your bubble, but it's just the way. The great Cathedral of St. John in Episcopal in Denver is aligned just the same way as our church, except it's not, because its apse is in the south, which is not liturgically correct. Why do these things happen? It's normally because of the layout of the blocks. In Denver, the blocks are long southwest and short, or long north-south and short east-west. Here, I'm not certain why we did this. I think it's wonderful, especially in the winter when light streams into the back of the church. Maybe not for slideshows in here. This is sort of comparing then the photograph of the back of that really fabled church with her painting on the upper left. And then here she is. Most of us sort of know her with this very sort of, dare I say, leather-worn face that spent lots and lots of time out of doors and in the latter part of her life at Ghost Ranch. I'm going to talk real briefly about a fellow, and be really honest with me. How many of you have not heard of this guy, Gunnar Vidforce? So a whole lot of hands. He's in some ways called Mr. Yosemite, but he just didn't paint Yosemite. This is Sentinel Rock in Yosemite, and that's upper and lower Yosemite Falls. He painted more than 80 works of the Grand Canyon. And these are all works that are en plein air, okay? So he's not painting in a studio. He's actually dealing with all the bugs and the gnats and the dust, and his canvas probably being blown off the easel, right? And his painting of water here in the inner gorge, and he paints the Grand Canyon again and again and again, rather spectacular fashion, capturing it in its different moods and different times of the day. And in fact, we've all heard of a guy named Frederick Remington. Frederick Remington composed and directed the original performance of the Grand Canyon Suite. Well, Frederick Remington was given one of these paintings of the Grand Canyon that Gunnar Vidforce entitled On the Trail. Well, one of the suites in the Grofé Grand Canyon Suite is entitled On the Trail, and it's the one where it's sort of emblematic of mules walking down the Bright Angel Trail. This is my favorite piece by him because of the yawing depth. You don't see the bottom of the canyon. It's like this heart-stopping business. And of course, who would ever try to describe the Grand Canyon in words? It's just one of those places. Show of hands, how many people have been to the South Rim? How many to the north rim? Smaller number. So my charge to that group that's only been to the south rim is you got to get to the north rim. You just have to. It's just a wonderful experience as well. Ernest Blumenschein is considered the father of what's called the Taos Society, or the Taos 7, sometimes referred to as the Taos 6, most of the time referred to as the Taos 7, and these were a group of artists that sort of congregated in Taos in the early part of the 20th century. He's really considered the, how shall I put it, as Monet is to Impressionism, Blumenschein is to the Taos Society. He's really considered maybe the godfather of the movement, and painted portraits of Indians, such as this. Wonderful shots of Indians with headdresses and in ways that we don't tend to see, with the lighter green feathers down towards the face, and the raw turkey feathers or eagle feathers that are so oftentimes shown as white, which we would tend to see like right here in this war bonnet of the face of the Indian is facing you, as opposed to this Indian, and that war bonnet is completely different. That's another shot closer up of sort of a quintessential Blumenschein American Indian of the Southwest, because we, of course, underneath his chin, we see these this amazing sort of buttes of northern New Mexico. And then even some fabulous landscapes, maybe a little hard to see, but there's a whole group or congregation of fishermen that are on this point in this bend in the river. There's another fellow standing down here. This right here is the entrance to that very church that I was talking about that George O'Keeffe painted the back side of in South Taos. And there are a lot of Blumenscheins that are on display over at the Broadmoor, but I need to just warn you, they're giclées. They're not the originals. The only original oil painting over there that's owned by Anschutz is behind the main desk by Maxfield Parrish, and it's a painting of the Broadmoor. And if you go in there and act like you're going to be checking in, you just look important when you walk up to the desk, so you can take a look at that painting. If you look at that painting, you'll see that the lake is on the wrong side of the Broadmoor. It's in front. It's on the east side, not on the west side. So that's ultimate artistic license on the part of Maxfield Parrish. This is one of my favorites. This is the Sangre de Cristos, or the blood of Christ, that we see up in here, and the Taos Pueblo. And there's a group of Indians that are making their way away from the Pueblo in the foreground. This is one of the giclées, by the way, that I think is over at the Broadmoor, still hung. There are a beautiful series of giclées, and many of the Blumenscheins are on display. This giclée is a near perfect image of the painting that's put on gesso and canvas, so that most of us wouldn't know it's not the original oil. But trust me, the Anschutz Collection, he would not probably risk lots of running little children unsupervised around the original works in the Broadmoor. How many of us have walked that and seen what I'm talking about? It's wonderful in its own right. So there's a fat man. Do we see him right here in the middle of this almost ellipse of figures? This is a sacred dance at one of the pueblos. And I'm going to mention something here about Western art, and especially Southwestern art. I'm going to talk a little bit about mystical spirituality. And then also something that Robert Redford referred to, and I'll show us some images here in just a sec, entitled Magical Realism, okay? And Redford was referring to John Nichols' story, The Milagro Beanfield War, and the movie that he made. And he kept talking about magical realism. Well, Blumenschein sort of starts that. Now, a lot of us have been to this hotel. My wife Ann and I were lucky enough to be in here last November. It's the La Fonda in the middle of Santa Fe, sort of an aerial shot of it. And inside that hotel is the art of a fellow named Gerald Cassidy. Now, this is one of the great murals that he painted of the conquistadors in the middle and on the far left and on the far right, and a map of that whole part of the world. This is actually in situ above a fireplace in one of the conference rooms south of the plazuela, the big atrium in the middle of that grand old storied hotel. But if we go inside this hotel, it's sort of the unofficial living room of Santa Fe. It's just sort of a wonderful place, and a lot of people here now with COVID masks on, but in the old days, of course, there's a wonderful bar. There's a great French patisserie on the north side of this that was designed by a woman named Mary Coulter. A lot of us have probably had a croissant or coffee in there. There's a great restaurant here that's called La Plazuela. If you go to La Plazuela, you gotta order the Chili Rellenos Christmas, okay? Which is part red sauce, part green sauce. Just trust me on this, okay? If you're down there. Well, if we wander around the lobby when we're waiting to go to lunch or dinner, there's tons of these fabulous Gerald Cassidy paintings. Here's one of Kit Carson. There's another of Fray Marcos, or Father Marcos. This is one of my favorites, Los Motechenes Dancer, which is this interesting mystical combination of Christianity and Indian First Nation person in terms of imagery. Here's one entitled Navajo. These are all inside the La Fonda, okay? The Eagle Dancer and the Buffalo Dancer. The Buffalo Dancer, for me, confession is good for the soul here. I've actually stood and looked at this painting trying to determine how it's attached to the wall so I could take it out of the hotel and keep it for my selfish self, okay? So now that I've just gotten that out of there, I shouldn't ever have a problem with that, but I just really covet the Buffalo Dancer. Everybody know in that foyer all these wonderful works of art by Gerald Cassidy? It's sort of spectacular that they have it all. Gustav Bauman. Gustav Bauman is another one of these southwestern artists. He's a great woodblock printer. So most of his art and most of his vision happens in a 12-inch by 12-inch area. And we see a photo of him and hear him working at the print. But I mean, look at the lilacs here in Santa Fe, or we're outside of Santa Fe and sort of the rugged course of just the Southwest. These are very involved prints because they're prints where each color is its own block. And a lot of these are also in the style which is called subtractive. So he would print one color and then he would carve into the block again and print the next. So if there's only 150 Baumans, that's it, because he was basically slowly destroying the wood block as he was painting each color or printing each color. So they're really quite precious. He's also involved in this mystical spirituality, this magical realism, we would call it, of the Indian dances in the Pueblo. This one, forgive me, you just have to trust me, there are petroglyphs that are carved into the cliff up above where the dwellings were. This is at a place called Bandelier, which is a national monument. Many of you might have toured it. It's not too far from Los Alamos, Bandelier National Monument. He was obsessed with Indian dances, and here's a shot of Indians dancing at one of the pueblos. I think this is Jemez Pueblo. But this is what I want to focus in on, these kachina pieces by him. These kachinas are moving around. They're like people. They've come out of this particular archway. They are not static. They are moving, okay? And you're going to say, well, was Bauman aware of THC before the latter part of the 20th century? I don't think so. He's doing this piece, which is a couple of dozen kachina. This one's sitting on this fellow like he's a bench, and these are what are called kosharis, the black and white striped fellows, and they're holding this post with a couple of these particular kachinas crawling up. So the whole point here is this sort of otherworldliness. Maybe when we turn away from the kachina collection, or we're not in the room, that maybe they take on a life of their own. He was familiar with Blumenschein's paintings of those mystical ceremonies, and he's taking it to the next step here with the kachinas. So why do I have a photo of the Santuario in Chimayo on the screen? Well, suffice to say, the last time Pope John Paul II came to the United States, he came to 3 places in North America. He came to the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., a great, great, great spiritual edifice. He came to the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in St. Louis, which is another extreme masterwork of architecture. It is a masterpiece. And he came to this little church north of Santa Fe, the Santuario. Now, it may be a little washed out, but last November, I did this drawing of the Santuario in front of that church. How many of us have been inside this sanctuary? Lots of people here. This is good. So we come into the sanctuary. It's very old, it's very venerated, but what's really important about this place, I don't think, is the reredos at the main altar. You go through this little door to the north, and there's a room back there that has a little hole in it with dirt in a circular little opening, and it's sacred dirt right here. And this fellow's staring into that. This is a pretty important place to me because I took some of this dirt and I mixed it with water, and it was about 19 years ago when I had a pretty serious diagnosis of melanoma, and they carved a huge melon-like lump out of my upper right leg, and I didn't know if I was going to be here, but just sort of being in this place was incredibly comforting, apparently to others, because there are hundreds of crutches, a couple of wheelchairs. Suffice to say, this is sort of the Lourdes of northern New Mexico. It's this place where a lot of miracles have happened, and not just hearsay. I mean, the Vatican's been looking into this place for a long, long time. So a lot of us, if you've been there, have been in this room, haven't you? Seeing all these crutches, yeah. And that gets me into this sort of mix of magical realism and mystical spirituality again, because sometimes people miss it. There's another sanctuary right near the Santuario that's dedicated to this guy, and his name is Santo Niño de Atocha, okay? And he is the Pellegrino. He's the pilgrim that looks like Santiago, but he's a child, and he wanders the hills and fields at night. And so people put out little baby shoes for this guy, little child shoes. And Santo Niño de Atocha is sort of this mix of Christianity with something that's a little bit beyond that. And we see his imagery all over northern New Mexico and the Southwest, but particularly at that shrine. And a lot of people, they go to the santuario, but they miss going into this shrine that's just really up the hill. And there's even now a new room where apparently all the shoes, hundreds of pairs of children's shoes, are on display because he wears them out as he wanders at night. And so there's a votive figure of Santo Niño de Atocha, which is more Spanish than anything. And that gets me to this guy, a guy that wrote Nirvana Blues, but I think maybe a greater book than Nirvana Blues by John Nichols was the Milagro Beanfield War. And that led to Robert Redford making the movie, roughly based geographically in and around Truches, New Mexico. And it's about, again, Redford coined it when he was interviewed about this film, which was quite successful, by the way, that there's something going on in northern New Mexico with the light, with the Sangre de Cristos, with the First Nation presence for maybe thousands of years, maybe as many as 7,000 to 9,000 years, with the Spanish families, with the weavers in and around Chimayo, like the Ortegas, with the art. Here's a Gustav Bauman print. And so these are, that's the figure, Joe Mondragon, that whole movie's about. He's the guy that breaks open the canal and illegally starts watering his bean field. And of course, the pig here is not just a pig, it's sort of a holy pig. And the old man with the Coca-Cola glasses, his name is Amarante. And the pig is his friend. And this guy right here, notice how his sombrero is folded back. He's the ghost that plays the accordion in the movie. And his hat is mysteriously like Santiago or Santo Niño de Atocha. And he's in this old wreck of a car. And remember, he's the one that's walking right here at the very end, elbow to elbow with Amarante. And he says to Amarante in the movie, what we need here is a big sacrifice. And that's all about this magical realism, this mystical spirituality. I would submit to you that's why we all go to northern New Mexico. We can't quite explain it, but we know it when we're feeling it on the back of our neck. And here's some more Gustav Bauman prints of fauna of the landscape, just gorgeous. He's quite famous for some of his adobe scenes. Here's the back of that church, once again in the snow that George O'Keeffe painted and Blumenschein painted the front of. His shots of Pueblos, these prints are very much in demand. You can always tell his prints because it's almost like a red hand glyph is his mark in the lower right-hand part of the print, as we see right here. It can be the white hand inside the red. It can even be the red positive, negative. He sort of experimented with that. 30 years ago, Gustav Bauman prints were $350 a piece. Now they're $7,000 to $10,000 a piece. Should have been investing in those instead of our mutual funds, I'm thinking, eh? Here's one of some hollyhocks. This is a sort of a quintessential garden in Santa Fe with the territorial architecture. And then this is up in Bandelier, You can actually climb all the way up to that. Here's looking into that great maw of the Grand Canyon. This is one of my favorites. This is just simply entitled Old Santa Fe. Now, who else? Well, there's a photographer that was working for the WPA with a beard here and his cameras. His name was Ansel Adams. And I'll tell you what, this is magical realism. It's Moon over Hernandez, where they may be a little bit washed out, but you'll see bright spots of white in the cemetery. Those are all the crosses in the cemetery. And the magic of Ansel Adams is that it's not so much the photograph, it's what he did in the development room with chemicals to emphasize certain parts of the photograph when he was developing it. In fact, he uses that same proportionality of a third landscape, two-thirds sky that Jacob van Ruysdael used as one of the Dutch masters. He took lots of shots, made a place called Canyon de Chelly very, very, very famous. These are all Ansel Adams photographs. This is Zion National Park, the two patriarchs. So famous, in fact, that this photograph of the Great White Throne becomes a WPA poster in the 1930s celebrating the national parks. And of course, what's happening at this point with the West, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, plus we're still quite a ways away from the interstate highway system under Eisenhower in the 50s, but in the 30s, people were taking legendary trains like the Chief, the Super Chief, and the El Capitan, and travel to the Grand Canyon became more and more and more popular. The back east excursions. Movies were being filmed out here, not so much in northern New Mexico, but in a place called Monument Valley, especially by a guy upper left hand named John Ford, and a young upstart in the lower part, the sort of animation loop, sort of an unimportant person to Hollywood named John Wayne, who was in this Stagecoach film. In fact, there's Wayne and Ford in that upper right photograph. Well, he also makes a film that I think John Wayne probably deserved the Oscar for in 1956 called The Searchers, where he plays Ethan Edwards. It's just a masterpiece. I know he won it for True Grit. He probably should have won it for this. This, I think, and The Quiet Man are maybe the two greatest films that Wayne ever made, both directed by the same guy, John Ford. In fact, the end of the movie is on the right-hand side, that image of Ethan Edwards standing in the frame of the door after he's delivered Natalie Wood, the daughter, back to her family. So I'd like to spend just a little time in closure with this sort of whirlwind tour with a fellow named Maynard Dixon. Ann and I were lucky enough last year to see a retrospective of his at the Scottsdale Museum of Fine Art. I think there were 120 paintings by him. And you'll know him. At first he was illustrating for Sunset and Collier's and did great murals, and then he broke into fine art. But it's really the scale of man here in the lower right with on the guy with the buckboard that's almost sort of lost, except as a shadowed outline with these gigantic buttes. He painted Indians in ceremony. This Indian Maiden. I love this piece because we don't know if this medicine man is 6 feet high or 600 feet high. He seems larger than the Statue of Liberty, I think very purposefully. Look at this wonderful figure of an Indian on horseback with those gigantic southwestern kinds of clouds that we all love. Here's a shot of the Great White Throne in Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. And here's, photo isn't quite from the same position, but Angel's Landing in the foreground and the Great White Throne, this gigantic 2,500-foot edifice in the background. Mankind is always dwarfed by the landscape in Maynard Dixon paintings of the Southwest, where he's painting the shade as lavender mid-purple. And that's exactly what the shade does down here. The shade even does that. In fact, I have this theory, personal theory, the Southwest of the United States starts as you start driving south down Monument Hill. Because the light north of there is different than the light south. And as we continue towards Walsenburg and Trinidad, the light gets more and more different. Here's El Capitan on the left. This is north of Cayenta. These Maynard Dixon landscapes. At first, you look at the mesa or the butte, you don't even notice the cowpunchers with the cattle in the lower part of the painting until after a while. Mankind is just sort of a thin little ribbon there. More of these with these gigantic clouds. Those clouds, don't they seem almost like they're made out of plaster of Paris or something? They have great weight. They're the cowpuncher here. And again, he's using that same proportion as Jacob van Riestel, typically a third landscape and two-thirds skyscape. Again, this maybe even less so, upper left with the dominance and emphasis on the clouds. The Lone Rider, one of his most famous works. And then Leon Lufbridge, and he's practicing today. You may have seen his work around here. He does the Rockies. There's over near Aspen, the Maroon Bells. But it's really, look at this, even the Broadmoor he did. The old grand building, the original Broadmoor. But it's his southwestern scenes, I think, that really capture the imagination. His buttes and his towers of sandstone and his rendition of adobe buildings, both sacred and secular, or that big maw that we're aware of if you've been down there. It's called the Rio Grande Gorge, that river begins to cut, and it cuts deeper and deeper and deeper into the landscape. Here's one of my favorites. This is certainly magical realism or mystical spirituality, especially with this print of this church, Adobe Church. So I want to leave us at this sort of short journey through all of this art. This is a painting, Sacred Mother. It almost seems like it could be the Grand Canyon in the background. She's immense spiritually, I think, with the blanket over her head. And then, of course, we've already seen this, but this is pretty spellbinding, I think. And no wonder there was a retrospective of his work in Phoenix. I think that's traveling all over the country. And so with all of our challenges with light and with electronics, mostly my fault, that's all I have to say about Hearts of the West. Thanks for coming. We've got about 5 minutes if anyone, because I ran us pretty close, but thanks for being patient.
Will you be doing this presentation someplace else where we can really see these?
I will. It's interesting that you say this. I'm going to be doing this next March 17th at the Peel Jewett House for the Historic Preservation Alliance, and that's right up Cascade. It's on the same property as First Lutheran. And Dave Alvarez is going to be doing it next week. No, I'm wrong about that, Nancy. I will be doing this on May 5th. May 5th. Scratch what I just said. May 5th at the downtown studio of UCCS on Tejon. And all are welcome to that. but you got to pay $15 to get in. It's not free like here. And that I'm going to be doing a two-part series on Art of the American West. I start with the Anasazi. I go through the Hopi and the Navajo in terms of, and Hohokam and Magillon and Mimbres pottery. And then the second part is basically very similar to the lecture that I gave here. So I will be giving this again on May the 5th, and it's at 5:30 to 7 in the evening. Not that I'm trying to advertise for that, but just answering your question.
Chuck, can you forward me a link to that, and
Sure.
I can send it out to the forum
Sure.
email list?
So I just have a comment about the Western art. We went to the Brown Palace to celebrate Ruth's 90th birthday not that long ago. And we also went to the American Museum of Western Art, which is actually in an old brothel right near the Brown Palace.
Yeah, it's called the Navarre Hotel.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful old wooden home with 4 stories of Western art. And we had a wonderful docent who just took us through a lot of art from the beginning of when they started the Western art up to contemporary. I definitely recommend it, so there you go.
Thanks so much.
I love art, but I'm not that well educated in it. When I put Russell and Remington side by side, how do I tell them apart?
Well, there's no instant gratification answer for that, I'm afraid. We as Americans want the Cliff Notes. We want just the facts, ma'am, sort of thing. And some of their paintings are very, very, very similar, but there are big differences. Charlie Russell paints a lot more detail, like broken whiskey bottles and cards, and his people, there's a lot more involved with all of the gear that they're wearing. Remington is much more streamlined. He's much more simplistic. You can hardly ever tell their bronzes apart, though. The bronzes of Russell have more thumb and fingerprints on the clay that was eventually turned lost wax into bronze than Remington. Remingtons are more refined as bronzes. All of it is extraordinarily expensive, and you and I can't afford it. Too bad. Any other thoughts? Thanks. I know we need to get set up. Comment in the back here. Question?
Thank you. Have you seen any of the work of the young man here in the Springs whose first name is Cody? He's 19 years old, and he's painting these fabulous, huge pictures of the West and the mountains.
Don't know his work. I'm sorry to say.
I'll have to show it to you because
Okay.
we watched him doing one of his paintings, and it was extraordinary. Real detail.
What's his last name?
I can't remember. He had a showing, and I just don't remember. It was here in the Springs. I'll find out for you.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I think we should say thank you very much again, Chuck. I think despite the light, I think it was still very worthwhile.